Chapter 7, Part 1 of The Uttermost Farthing. Recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. The Uttermost Farthing by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 7. The Uttermost Farthing. Part 1. Intense was the curiosity with which I turned to the last entry in Humphrey Challoner's Museum Archives. Not that I had any doubt as to the issue of the adventure that it recorded. I had seen the specimen numbered 25 in the shallow box, and its identity had long since been evident. But this fact mitigated my curiosity not at all. The archives had furnished a continuous narrative, surely one of the strangest ever committed to writing, and now I was to read the climax of that romantically terrible story, to witness the final achievement of that object that my poor friend had pursued with such unswerving pertinacity. I extract the entire entry with the exception of one or two passages near the end, for the reasons the omission of which will be obvious to the reader. Circumstances attending the acquirement of the specimen numbered 25 in the anthropological series. A. Osteology. B. Reduced dry preparations. The months that followed the events connected with the acquirement of the specimens 23 and 24 brought me nothing but aching suspense and hope deferred. The pursuit of the common criminal I had abandoned since I had got scent of my real quarry. The concussor lay idle in the basket. The cellar steps were greased no more. I had but a passive role to play until the hour should strike to usher in the final scene, if that should ever be. Though the term of my long exile in East London was drawing nigh, its approach was unseen by me. I could but wait, and what is harder than waiting? I had made cautious inquiries among the alien population, but no one knew Piragoff, or, at least, admitted any knowledge of him. And as to the police, when they had made a few arrests and then released the prisoners, they appeared to let the matter drop. The newspapers were, of course, more active. One of them described circumstantially how the 3 anarchists who escaped from the house in Saul Street had been seen together in an East End restaurant, and several others followed from day to day the supposed whereabouts of a mysterious person known as Paul the Plumber, whom the police declared to be a picturesque myth. But for me there was one salient fact. Of those 3 ruffians one was still at large, and no one seemed to have any knowledge of him. It was some 4 months later that I again caught up the scent. A certain Friday evening early in February found me listlessly tidying up the shop, for the Jewish Sabbath had begun and customers were few. But about 8 o'clock a man strode in jauntily, hung up his hat and seated himself in the operating chair, and at that moment a second man entered and sat down to wait. I glanced at this latter, and in an instant my gorge rose at him. I cannot tell why. To the scientific mind, intuitions are abhorrent. They are mostly wrong and wholly unreasonable. But as I looked at that man a wave of instinctive dislike and suspicion swept over me. He was, indeed, an ill-looking fellow enough. A broad, lozenge-shaped Tartar face, with great cheek-bones and massive jaws, a low forehead surmounted by a dense brush of upstanding grayish hair, beetling brows and eyes deep-set, fierce and furtive, combined to make a sufficiently unprepossessing countenance. Nor was his manner more pleasing. He scowled forbiddingly at me. He scrutinized the other customer, craning sideways to survey him in the mirror. He looked about the shop and he stared inquisitively at the parlor door. Every movement was expressive of watchful, uneasy suspicion. I tried to avoid looking at him lest my face should betray me, and, to divert my thoughts, concentrated my attention on the other customer. The latter unconsciously gave me every assistance in doing so. Though by no means a young man, he was the vainest and most dandified client I had ever had under my hands. He stopped me repeatedly to give exhaustive directions as to the effect that he desired me to produce. He examined himself in the glass and consulted me anxiously as to the exact disposition of an artificially curled forelock. I cursed him inwardly, for I wanted him to be gone and leave me alone with the other man. But for that very reason, and that I might conceal my impatience, I did his bidding and treated him with elaborate care. But now and again my glance would stray to the other man, and as I caught his fierce, suspicious eye, like the eye of a hunted animal, I would look away quickly, lest he should read what was in my mind. At length I had finished with my dandy client. I had brushed his hair to a nicety, and had even curled his forelock with heated tongs. With a sigh of relief I took off the cloth and waited for him to rise. But he rose not. Stroking his cheek critically, he decided that he wanted shaving, and, cursing him in my heart, I had to comply. I had acquired some reputation as a barber, and, I think, deserved it. I could put a perfect edge on a razor, and I wielded the instrument with a sensitive hand and habitual care. My client appreciated my skill, and complimented me patronizingly in very fair English, though with a slight Russian accent, delaying me intolerably to express his approval. When I had shaved him, he asked for pink powder to be applied to his chin, and when I had powdered him, he directed me to shape his moustache with pate hongris, a process which he superintended with anxious care. At last the fellow was actually finished. He got up from the chair and surveyed himself in the large wall mirror. He turned his head from side to side and tried to see the back of it. He smiled into the mirror, raised his eyebrows, frowned, and, in fact, tried a variety of expressions and effects, including a slight and graceful bow. Then he approached the glass to examine a spot on his cheek, leaned against it with outspread hands to inspect his teeth, and finally put out his tongue to examine that, too. I almost expected that he would ask me to brush it. However, he did not. Adjusting his necktie delicately, he handed me my fee with a patronizing smile and remarked, "You are a good barber. You have taste and you take trouble. I give you a penny for yourself, and I shall come to you again." As the door closed behind him, I turned to the other customer. He rose, walked over to the operating chair and sat down sullenly, keeping an eye on me all the time, and something in his face expressive of suspicion, uneasiness, and even fear, seemed to hint at something unusual in my own appearance. It was likely enough. Hard as I had struggled to smother the tumult of emotions that seethed within me, some disturbance must have reached the surface, some light in the eye, some tension of the mouth to tell of the fierce excitement, the raging anxiety, that possessed me. I was afraid to look at him for fear of frightening him away. Was he the man? Was this the murderer, Piragoff, the slayer of my wife? The question rang in my ears as, with a far from steady hand, I slowly lathered his face. Instinct told me that he was, but even in my excitement reason rejected a mere unanalyzable belief. For what is an intuition? Brutally stated, it is simply a conclusion reached without premises. I had always disbelieved in instinct and intuition, and I disbelieve still. But what had made me connect this man with Piragoff? He was clearly a Russian. He looked like a villain. He had the manner of a nihilist or violent criminal of some kind. But all this was nothing. It formed no rational basis for the conviction that possessed me. There was his hair, of course, a wiry mop of queer grayish-brown. It might well, from its color, be ringed hair, and if it was I should have little doubt of the man's identity. But was it? I was getting on in years and could not see near objects clearly without my spectacles, and I had laid down my spectacles somewhere in the parlor. As I lathered his face, I leaned over him to look at his hair more closely, but he shrank away in fierce alarm, and, after all, my eyesight was not good enough. Once I tried to get out my lens, but he challenged me furiously as to my object, and I put it away again. I dared not provoke him to violence, for if he had struck me, I should have killed him on the spot, and he might be the wrong man. The operation of shaving him was beset with temptations from moment to moment. Forgotten anatomical details revived in my memory. I found myself tracing through the coarse skin those underlying structures that were so near to hand. Now I was at the angle of the jaw, and as the ringed blade swept over the skin I traced the edge of the strap-like muscle and mentally marked the spot where it crossed the great carotid artery. I could even detect the pulsation of the vessel. How near it was to the surface! A little dip of the razor's beak at that spot. But still I had no clear evidence that he was the right man. A mere impression, a feeling of physical repulsion unsupported by any tangible fact, was not enough to act on. One moment a savage impatience for retribution urged me to take the chance, to fell him with a blow and fling him down into the cellar. The next, my reason stepped in and bade me to hold my hand and wait for proof. And all the time he watched me like a cat and kept his hands thrust into the hip pockets of his coat. Again and again these mental oscillations occurred. Now I was simply and savagely homicidal, and now I was rational, almost judicial. Now the vital necessity was to prevent his escape, and yet, again, I shrank from the dreadful risk of killing an innocent man. What the issue might have been I cannot say, but suddenly the door opened, a burly carter entered and sat down, and the opportunity was gone. The Russian waited for no lengthy inspection in the glass like his predecessor. As soon as he was finished he sprang from the chair, slapped down his coppers in payment and darted out of the shop, only too glad to take himself off in safety. There must have been something very sinister in my appearance. The carter seated himself in the chair, and I fell to work on him mechanically, but my thoughts were with the man who was gone. What a fiasco it had been! After waiting all these years, I had met a man whom I suspected to be the very wretch I sought. I had actually been alone with him, and I had let him go. The futility of it! Before my eyes the grinning tenants of the great wall case rose in reproach. The little impassive faces in those shallow boxes seemed to look at me and ask why they had been killed. I had let the man go, and he would certainly never come to my shop again. True, I should know him again, but what better chance could I ever have of identifying him? And then again came the unanswerable question. Was he really the man, after all? So my thoughts fluttered to and fro. Constant only was a feeling of profound dejection, a sense of unutterable, irretrievable failure. The carter, a regular customer, rose and looked askance at me as he rubbed his face with the towel. He remarked that I seemed to be feeling a bit dull tonight, paid his fee, and, with a civil "good evening," took his departure. When he had gone I stood by the chair wrapped in a gloomy reverie. Had I failed, finally? Was my long quest at an end with my object unachieved? It almost seemed so. I raised my eyes and they fell on my reflection in the large mirror, and suddenly it was borne in on me that I was an old man. The passing years of labor and mental unrest had left deep traces. My hair, which was black when I first came to the East, was now snow white, and the face beneath it was worn and wrinkled and aged. The sands of my life were running out apace. Soon the last grains would trickle out of the glass, and then would come the end, the futile end, with the task still unaccomplished. And for this I had dragged out these 20 weary years, ever looking for repose and eternal reunion. How much better to have spent those years in the peace of the tomb by the dear companion of my sunny hours. I stepped up to the glass and looked more closely at my face, to mark the crow's feet and intersecting wrinkles in the shrunken skin. Yes, it was an old, old face, a weary face, too, that spoke of sorrow and anxious thought and strenuous, unsatisfying effort. And presently it would be a dead face, calm and peaceful enough then, and the wretch who had wrought all the havoc would still stalk abroad with his heavy debt unpaid. Something on the surface of the mirror interposed between my eye and the reflection, slightly blurring the image. I focused on it with some difficulty, and then saw that it was a group of finger marks, the prints made by the greasy fingers of my dandy customer when he had leaned on the glass to inspect his teeth. As they grew distinct to my vision, I was aware of a curious sense of familiarity, at first merely subconscious and not strongly attracting my attention. But this state lasted only for a few brief moments. Then the vague feeling burst into full recognition. I snatched out my lens and brought it to bear on those astounding impressions. My heart thumped furiously. A feeling of awe, of triumph, of fierce joy and fiercer rage surged through me, and mingled with profound self-contempt. There could be no mistake. I looked at those fingerprints too often. Every ridge mark, every loop and whirl of the varying patterns was engraved on my memory. For 20 years I had carried the slightly enlarged photographs in my pocket-book, and hardly a day had passed without my taking them out to con them afresh. I had them in my pocket now to justify rather than aid my memory. I held the open book before the glass and compared the photographs with the clearly printed impressions. There were 7 fingerprints on the mirror, 4 on the right hand and 3 on the left, and all were identical with the corresponding prints on the photographs. No doubt was possible. But if it had been... I darted across to the chair. The floor was still littered with the cuttings from that villain's head. In my idiotic preoccupation with the other man I had let that wretch depart without a glance at his hair. I grabbed up a tuft from the floor and gazed at it. Even to the unaided eye it had an unusual quality when looked at closely, a soft, shimmering appearance like that of some delicate textile. But I gave it only a single glance. Then rushing through to the parlor, I spread a few hairs on a glass slip and placed it on the stage of the microscope. A single glance clenched the matter. As I put my eye to the instrument there, straying across the circular field, were the broad gray stripes, each with its dark line of medulla obscured at intervals by rings of tiny bubbles. The demonstration was conclusive. This was the very man. Humanly speaking, no error or fallacy was possible. I stood up and laughed grimly. So much for instinct. For what fools call intuition and wise men recognize as mere slipshod reasoning. I could understand my precious intuition now, could analyze it into its trumpery constituents. It was the old story. Unconsciously I had built up the image of a particular kind of man, and when such a man appeared I had recognized him at a glance. The villainous Tartar face, I had looked for it. The fierce, furtive, hunted manner, the restless suspicion, the mop of grayish-brown hair. I had expected them all, and there they were. My man would have these peculiarities, and here was a man who had them. He, therefore, was the man I sought. Oh, good old undistributed middle term! How many intuitions have been born of you! My triumph was short-lived. A moment's reflection sobered me. True, I had found my murderer, but I had lost him again. That bird of ill omen was still a bird in the bush, in the tangled bush of criminal London. He had said that he would come back to me again, and I hoped he would. But who could say? Other eyes than mine were probably looking for him. I suppose I am by nature an optimist. Otherwise I should not have continued the pursuit all these years. Hence, having mastered the passing disappointment, I settled myself patiently to wait in the hope of my victim's ultimate reappearance. Not entirely passively, however, for, after the shop was shut, I went abroad nightly to frequent the foreign restaurants and other less reputable places of the East End, in the hopes of meeting him and jogging his memory. The active employment kept my mind occupied and made the time of waiting seem less long, but it had no further result. I never met the man, and, as the weeks passed without bringing him to my net, I had the uncomfortable feeling that his hair must have grown and been trimmed by someone else, unless, indeed, he had fallen into the clutches of the law. Meanwhile, I quietly made my preparations, which involved 1 or 2 visits to a ship chandler's, and laid down a scheme of action. It would be a delicate business. The villain was some 15 years younger than I, a sturdy ruffian and desperate, as I had seen. My own strength and activity had been failing for some time now. Obviously I could not meet him on equal terms. Moreover, I must not allow him to injure me. That was a point of honor. This was to be no trial by wager of battle. It was to be an execution. Any retaliation by him would destroy the formal, punitive character which was the essence of the transaction. The weeks sped by. They lengthened into months, and still my visitor made no appearance. My anxiety grew. There were times when I looked at my white hair and doubted, when I almost despaired. But those times passed and my spirits revived. On the whole, I was hopeful and waited patiently, and in the end my hopes were justified and my patience rewarded. It was a fair evening early in June, Wednesday evening, I recollect, when at last he came. Fortunately the shop was empty, and again, oddly enough, it was some Jewish holiday. I welcomed him effusively. No fierce glare came from my eyes now. I was delighted to see him, and he was flattered at the profound impression his former visit had made on me. I began very deliberately, for I could hardly hold the scissors and was afraid that he would notice the tremor, which in fact he did. "Why does your hand shake so much, Mr. Vosper?" he asked in his excellent English. "You have not been curling your little finger, hein?" I reassured him on this point, but used a little extra caution until the tremor should subside, which it did as soon as I got over my first excitement. Meanwhile I let him talk. He was a boastful, egotistical oaf, as might have been expected, and I flattered and admired him until he fairly purred with self-satisfaction. It was very necessary to get him into a good humor. My terror from moment to moment was that some other customer should come in, though a holiday evening was usually a blank in a business sense until the Christian shops shut. Still, It was a serious danger which impelled me to open my attack with as little delay as possible. I had several alternative plans and I commenced with the one that I thought most promising. Taking advantage of a little pause in the conversation, I said in a confidential tone, "I wonder if you can give me a little advice. I want to find somebody who will buy some valuable property without asking too many questions, and who won't talk about the deal afterwards. A safe person, you know. Can you recommend me such a person?" He turned in the chair and looked at me. All his self-complacent smiles were gone in an instant. The face that looked into mine was the face of as sinister a villain as I have ever clapped eyes on. "The person you mean," he said fiercely, "is a fence, a receiver. Why do you ask me if I know a fence? Who are you? Are you a spy for the police, Hein? What should I know about receivers? Answer me that." He glared at me with such furious suspicion that I instinctively opened my scissors and looked at the neighborhood of his carotid. But I took his question quite pleasantly. "That's what they all say," I remarked with a foolish smile. "Who do?" he demanded. "Everybody that I ask. They all say, 'What should I know about fences?' It's very inconvenient for me." "Why is it inconvenient to you?" he asked less savagely, and with evidently awakening curiosity. I gave an embarrassed cough. "Well, you see, it's this way. Supposing I have some property, valuable property, but of a kind that is of no use to me. Naturally, I want to sell it, but I don't want it talked about. I'm a poor man. If I am known to be selling things of value, people may make uncharitable remarks and busybodies may ask inconvenient questions. You see my position?" Piragoff looked at me fixedly, eagerly. A new light was in his eye now. "What have you got?" he demanded. I coughed again. "Aha!" I said with a smile. "It is you who are asking questions now." "But you ask me to advise you. How can I if I don't know what you've got to sell? Perhaps I might buy the stuff myself, Hein?" "I think not," said I, "unless you can write a check for 4 figures. But perhaps you can." "Yes, perhaps I can, or perhaps I can get the money. Tell me what the stuff is." I clipped away at the top of my speed, and I could cut hair very quickly if I tried. No fear of his slipping away now. I had him fast. "It's a complicated affair," I said hesitatingly, "and I don't want to say much about it if you're not in the line. I thought you might be able to put me on to a safe man in the regular trade." Piragoff moved impatiently, then glanced at the parlor door. "Anyone in that room?" he asked. "No," I answered. "I live here all alone." "No servant? No one to look after you?" He asked the questions with ill-concealed eagerness. "No, I look after myself. It's cheaper, and I want so little." The last statement I made in accordance with a curious fact that I had observed, which is that the really infallible method of impressing a stranger with your wealth is to dilate on your poverty. The statement had its usual effect. Piragoff fidgeted slightly, glanced at the shop door, and said, "Finish my hair quickly and let us go in there and talk about this." I chuckled inwardly at his eagerness. Even his personal appearance had become a secondary consideration. I bustled through the rest of the operation, whisked off the cloth, and opened the parlor door. He rose, glanced at his reflection in the glass, looked quickly at the shop door, and followed me into the little room, shutting and bolting the door after him. End of Chapter 7, Part 1.